Right now, over 1,000 massive oil tankers have completely vanished from global maritime tracking systems. This rogue armada is illegally transporting millions of barrels of sanctioned crude every single day, threatening to trigger the worst maritime ecological disaster in human history, while actively funding geopolitical conflict. With billions of illicit dollars flowing entirely outside the reach of international regulators, how long can the global economy survive this invisible siege? Welcome to the dark side of international logistics. Today we are exposing the Shadow Fleet, a vast, unregulated network of aging vessels systematically dismantling the rules of global trade. According to a recent investigative report by Reuters, an estimated 1,400 vessels currently operate within the global Shadow Fleet, functioning in a state of perpetual maritime invisibility. To understand how thousands of tankers pull off this vanishing act, we must look at the deliberate manipulation of the Automatic Identification System, or AIS. International maritime law mandates that all commercial vessels over 300 gross tonnage broadcast their identity, position, course, and speed. However, rogue operators are systematically disabling these transponders as they enter designated dark zones near sanctioned export terminals. But simply going dark is no longer enough. Bloomberg reports that these fleets have escalated to military-grade GPS spoofing. By transmitting manipulated coordinate data, a tanker can broadcast a digital footprint indicating it is idling safely in the Mediterranean Sea, while satellite imagery confirms the physical vessel is actually docking in a sanctioned port thousands of miles away. This creates a ghost ship, a digital phantom that completely confounds international maritime oversight. Furthermore, these vessels engage in aggressive flag hopping. Data from the International Maritime Organization indicates a massive surge in vessels switching their registration to obscure, under-resourced nations. By constantly shifting their flag state, these ships evade rigorous safety inspections and regulatory audits. They exploit maritime loopholes, bouncing from one jurisdiction to another before authorities can ground them, effectively staying one step ahead of international law. The physical disappearance of these ships is only half the equation. The true genius of the Shadow Fleet lies in its corporate obfuscation. The Financial Times reports that tracing the beneficial ownership of a shadow tanker usually leads to a labyrinth of anonymous shell companies. A single aging vessel might be owned by a brass plate company in the Caribbean, insured by an unrated entity in Eastern Europe, and operated by a management firm registered just days prior in the Middle East. This is not an accident. It is a meticulously engineered shell game. When Western sanctions tightened over the last 3 years, maritime hubs saw an overnight explosion of pop-up management companies. According to maritime intelligence firm Lloyd's List, hundreds of new shipping operations have emerged with no prior track record, specifically designed to purchase and operate end-of-life tankers. They act as corporate firewalls, shielding the true owners from legal liability and financial sanctions. Crucially, this entire logistics network runs on an alternative financial infrastructure. As reported by the World Bank, the Shadow Fleet is accelerating the fragmentation of global trade by settling transactions outside the US dollar and bypassing the SWIFT messaging network. Using clearinghouses in non-aligned nations, bartering systems, and regional currency swaps, this illicit trade effectively neutralizes Western financial supremacy, moving billions of dollars in illicit capital right under the nose of global regulators. Once the sanctioned crude is loaded, the logistics of laundering the cargo begin. This brings us to the most dangerous phase of the operation, the ship-to-ship or STS transfer. Data from S&P Global Commodity Insights shows a staggering increase in STS transfers in international waters, specifically in remote areas like the Mid-Atlantic and the South China Sea. Massive tankers come side by side on the open ocean, pumping millions of gallons of volatile crude oil between their hulls. It is a highly dangerous maneuver designed entirely to sever the chain of custody. To further confuse authorities, these ships undergo rapid physical alterations. The maritime executive has documented numerous instances where shadow vessels physically mask their identities. Crews routinely paint over IMO numbers on the hull, alter the paint schemes of the ship's funnel, and even change the physical name of the vessel mid-voyage to thwart visual identification by satellite and naval surveillance. Finally, to ensure the crude can be sold on the open market, it is chemically laundered. According to energy analysts at Argus Media, sanctioned crude is frequently mixed with legitimate supplies during these SDS transfers. The result is a chemical cocktail, a blended crude oil that completely masks the origin of the sanctioned product. By the time this blended oil reaches a refinery, customs officials and port authorities find it nearly impossible to definitively prove its illicit origins, allowing sanctioned energy to flow freely into the veins of the global economy. According to a 2026 risk assessment published by the International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation, or ITOP-F, the Shadow Fleet represents the highest concentration of substandard shipping on the oceans today. The structural integrity of these vessels is a massive red flag. The standard life cycle of a commercial crude oil tanker is roughly 15 to 20 years, after which it is typically sold for scrap due to metal fatigue and engine degradation. However, data from maritime analytics firm Windward indicates that the average age of a Shadow Fleet vessel now exceeds 25 years. Many of these ships entirely lack the modern double hull construction mandated by international environmental treaties, meaning a single grounding or collision would result in an immediate catastrophic breach of the cargo holds.
The financial liability of such an event is equally terrifying. Bloomberg Economics reports that traditional protection and indemnity, or P&I insurance, which covers environmental cleanup and third-party liabilities, is exclusively controlled by a handful of highly regulated Western syndicates. Because shadow vessels operate outside sanctioned financial networks, they rely on deeply opaque, unrated insurance providers based in non-compliant jurisdictions. If a shadow tanker runs aground, there is zero guarantee of a financial payout. The coastal nations where the spill occurs will be left to shoulder the devastating multi-billion-dollar cleanup costs entirely on their own.
This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is an active, escalating crisis. Throughout 2026, maritime authorities have documented severe near misses in some of the world's most critical and sensitive shipping corridors. According to Reuters, the Danish Straits, a narrow, treacherous choke point handling massive volumes of Baltic Sea traffic, has seen a sharp spike in distress calls from aging shadow tankers experiencing sudden engine failure. Similarly, in Southeast Asia's heavily congested Malacca Strait, often referred to by maritime strategists as the Malacca Trap due to its extreme navigational hazards, unregulated vessels conducting blind maneuvers without functioning AIS have nearly collided with legitimate commercial traffic. A major spill in either of these corridors would instantly paralyze regional trade and inflict irreversible ecological trauma on local coastlines. The consequences of this unregulated logistics network extend far beyond the immediate environmental threat. It is fundamentally warping the macroeconomic landscape. The World Bank notes that the existence of the shadow fleet has essentially bifurcated the global energy market into two parallel systems, a transparent, premium-priced legal market and a discounted, opaque dark market. This two-tiered system deeply undercuts the efficacy of international economic statecraft. By providing a reliable pipeline for sanctioned crude, the shadow fleet artificially suppresses global energy prices, which paradoxically forces compliant oil-producing nations to slash their own prices to remain competitive. Furthermore, Oxford Economics reports that legitimate shipping companies are suffering massive opportunity costs. Top-tier ocean carriers, forced to comply with rigorous environmental standards and expensive carbon regulations, are losing market share to rogue operators who completely bypass these operational overheads. The playing field is entirely uneven, punishing regulatory compliance while immensely rewarding illicit logistics. Recognizing the existential threat posed by these rogue operations, the international community has finally begun to coordinate a massive multi-jurisdictional crackdown. Naval forces and regulatory bodies are no longer relying solely on traditional Coast Guard patrols. According to Defense One, the European Union Naval Force and the United States Coast Guard have increasingly integrated advanced artificial intelligence and synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, to monitor dark zones. Even through heavy cloud cover and the dead of night, satellite AI monitoring can now identify the unique physical signatures and wake patterns of ghost vessels in real time, matching them against known shadow fleet databases. This technological surveillance is being paired with aggressive legal warfare. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, has significantly escalated its strategy. Rather than just targeting the physical ships, OFAC is systematically hunting the logistical supply chain. Financial Times reports that major economies are now blacklisting entire maritime service providers, from the obscure classification societies that incorrectly certify these ships as seaworthy to the local port authorities that allow them to dock. Assets are being frozen, and secondary sanctions are being deployed against international banks suspected of clearing payments for shell management companies. We are now witnessing a dramatic escalation as nations move beyond bureaucratic blacklisting to physical asset seizures. Several Mediterranean and Southeast Asian nations have begun detaining shadow tankers that enter their territorial waters under false pretenses, initiating lengthy legal forfeiture processes. This aggressive posture signals a massive shift in global maritime enforcement. The era of passive monitoring is ending. The cat and mace game between global regulators and rogue maritime operators is reaching a critical inflection point. As sanctions become tighter and enforcement grows more technologically sophisticated, the shadow fleet will undoubtedly attempt to innovate, finding new, deeper crevices in international maritime law to hide their illicit cargo. However, the stakes have never been higher. This is not just a story about moving oil. It is a battle for the integrity of global trade. The shadow fleet represents a direct assault on the rules-based international order, leveraging aging infrastructure and corporate anonymity to fund geopolitical instability. Every day these ghost ships operate, they risk unleashing an environmental catastrophe that will decimate coastal economies and destroy marine ecosystems for generations. The ultimate question is whether the international community has the political will to completely sever the financial arteries of this shadow economy, or if the lure of cheap, illicit energy will continue to outweigh the catastrophic risks. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the dangerous world of sanction evasion logistics. If you found this analysis valuable, Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more comprehensive breakdowns of the macroeconomic trends and geopolitical shifts defining our global economy. Let us know in the comments below, do you think advanced AI monitoring will be enough to finally sink the shadow fleet, or are rogue operators already one step ahead? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.